Hypnotic public speaking. The art of making people lean in, hang on, and never forget you. Introduction. The moment everything changes. There is a specific kind of silence that every speaker secretly dreams about. Not the silence of a bored audience checking their phones. Not the uncomfortable quiet that stretches between a nervous speaker's words like a rubber band about to snap. This is a different silence entirely. A thick, electric, almost breathing silence. The kind that fills a room when every single person has forgotten that they have a body, forgotten that their coffee is getting cold, forgotten that they had somewhere else to be. They are simply there, suspended in your words, waiting for what comes next with a hunger they couldn't explain if you asked them. You have felt this silence from the other side, as an audience member, maybe once or twice in your life. A teacher who changed how you saw the world. A speaker at a conference who made you pull out a notebook at midnight and start writing. A person at a dinner table who held 7 people completely still with nothing but a story. You remember exactly how it felt to be in that room. What you may not know yet is that this effect is not magic. It is not a gift that some people are born with, and others simply aren't. It is a precise, learnable, deeply human craft. And this book is going to hand it to you, piece by piece. Most people who are afraid of public speaking are afraid of the wrong thing. They spend their nights before a big presentation worrying about forgetting their lines, or stumbling over a word, or having a dry mouth, or the audience noticing their hand shake. These fears are understandable, but they are pointing in entirely the wrong direction. The real problem, the one that actually kills presentations, pitches, speeches, and conversations before they even begin, is not nervousness. It is disconnection. It is the invisible wall that goes up between a speaker and an audience the moment the speaker starts performing instead of communicating. You have seen this wall. You have sat behind it, politely watching someone go through their slides while your mind quietly drifted to your grocery list. The speaker on the other side of that wall may have had brilliant ideas, years of expertise, genuinely important things to say, but none of it reached you because the channel between you was never opened. This book is about opening that channel so wide that closing it becomes impossible. The word hypnotic in the title is not an exaggeration, and it is not a metaphor. Clinical hypnosis and masterful public speaking share more mechanics than most people realize. Both rely on focused attention, emotional engagement, the precise rhythm of language, the strategic use of silence, and the slow, careful bypassing of the listener's critical, defensive mind. When a great speaker holds a room, the audience is not passively receiving information. They are in an altered state of attention, more open, more imaginative, more emotionally available than they are in ordinary conversation. Their critical filters are lowered. Their imagination is engaged. They feel things. They remember things. And they are changed by the experience in ways that last long after they've left the room. This is not manipulation. This is what human communication was always designed to do. It is just that most people were never taught how to do it deliberately. This book will solve several problems that might feel very familiar to you right now. If you have ever stood in front of an audience and felt your carefully prepared speech dissolve into a fog of anxiety, you will find specific, practical tools here for transforming that anxiety into fuel. If you have ever watched the eyes in a room glaze over halfway through your presentation and not known how to bring the audience back, you will learn exactly which techniques to use and precisely when to use them. If you have ever delivered a talk that felt technically correct but somehow flat, like you said all the right things but nobody seemed to feel anything, you'll understand after reading this book what ingredient was missing and how to add it. If you have ever envied the speaker who can walk into any room, with any audience on any topic, and within 60 seconds have every person leaning forward, you'll by the end of this book have a clear and detailed map of exactly how they do that. And if you are already a confident speaker who simply wants to become extraordinary, someone whose words don't just inform, but genuinely move people, then what follows will give you the architecture of that next level. There are 7 chapters ahead of you. Each one builds on a last like floors of a building, and by the time you reach the top, you will be standing somewhere very different from where you started. We will begin at the very foundation, psychology of what actually happens inside a listener's brain and body when a speaker captures them, because you cannot build hypnotic presence without understanding the terrain you are working in. From there, we will move through craft of story, the alchemy of voice and silence, the precise use of language patterns that bypass resistance and plant ideas directly into imagination, the art of reading and managing a live audience in real time, and surprisingly powerful role that your body plays in all of it. And then, in the final chapter, we will put everything together into a single, unified picture of what it means to be the kind of speaker that people talk about for years after they've heard you. One last thing before we begin. You may have picked up this book because you have a specific event coming up, a job interview, a board presentation, a wedding toast, a TED-style talk, a sales pitch, a difficult conversation you need to lead. That is a perfectly good reason to be here. But what you are about to learn goes considerably further than any single event. The skills of hypnotic communication change the way you are perceived in every room you enter, in every conversation you have, in every relationship you carry. The person who can speak in a way that makes others feel genuinely seen, genuinely moved, and genuinely changed, that person is one of the rarest and most powerful abilities in the world. Let's begin building it. Chapter 1. The architecture of attention. What actually happens inside a listener's brain? Before you can hypnotize a room, you need to understand what a room actually is. Not in the physical sense. The chairs, the lighting, the microphone stand with its slightly too short cord. What you need to understand is what a room full of people is neurologically, psychologically, emotionally. Because when you walk up to speak, you are not facing an audience. You're facing dozens or hundreds of individual nervous systems, each one running its own private program, each one filtering reality through its own history, fears, desires, and assumptions. Your job, your entire job, is to interrupt all those private programs simultaneously and replace them with a single shared experience. That is an extraordinary thing to attempt. And the speakers who do it consistently are the ones who understand, at least intuitively, how human attention actually works. Here is the first thing you need to know. Attention is not a steady state. It is not a spotlight that an audience member points at you and holds still. Attention is restless, hungry, and governed by a part of the brain that evolved hundreds of thousands of years before PowerPoint was invented. The human brain is a prediction machine. It is constantly, obsessively scanning its environment and asking one question above all others. What happens next? This is not a metaphor. Neuroscientists call it predictive processing. The brain's fundamental operating system is built around anticipating the future in order to survive it. What this means for you as a speaker is staggering in its implications. If your audience can predict exactly where you are going at every moment, if your talk unfolds in the order they expected, makes the points they assumed, ends the way they guessed, their brains will not bother paying attention. There is no survival advantage in monitoring something completely predictable. Boredom is not rudeness. Boredom is neuroscience. Think about the last time you were truly unable to look away from something. Maybe it was a film that kept you on the edge of your seat. Maybe it was an argument between two people you know that you absolutely should not have been listening to but could not stop. Maybe it was a story a stranger told you at a bar that you still remember 5 years later. In every one of those cases, the same neurological mechanism was at work. What researchers call the open loop. An open loop is an unanswered question, an unresolved tension, an incomplete pattern. Your brain cannot rest with an open loop. It is physically, biologically compelled to seek closure. When a speaker creates an open loop in the first 30 seconds, raises a question they don't immediately answer, introduces a tension they allow to hang in the air, begins a story they pause in the middle of, they have essentially grabbed the audience's nervous system by the collar. The audience is now neurologically obligated to keep listening. They have no choice. The loop must be closed. The great Italian director Federico Fellini once said that a different kind of attention is required to watch a dream than to watch a documentary. He was talking about film, but he was describing something that applies directly to speaking. There are two modes of listening that an audience can be in, and they produce radically different outcomes. The first is critical listening, the mode where the audience is evaluating, judging, comparing what you say to what they already believe, looking for flaws, deciding whether to agree or disagree. This is a mode most people unknowingly trigger when they begin a presentation with facts, statistics, arguments, and logical structures. The second mode is imaginative listening, the mode where the audience is not judging but experiencing, where they're constructing images and feelings in their own minds, where their defenses are lower because you haven't asked them to agree with anything, just to see something. Hypnotic speakers live almost entirely in the second mode. They do not argue their way into an audience's mind. They story their way in. Consider what happens in a listener's brain when you say, "Studies show that companies with diverse leadership teams outperform their competitors by an average of 35%. The listener's brain receives this as data. It routes the information to the prefrontal cortex, the analytical, critical, skeptical part of the brain. Somewhere in the audience, 3 people are already thinking, "I'd like to see the methodology on that study." 2 more are thinking, "That hasn't been my experience." 1 person is thinking about whether 35% refers to revenue, profit margin, or stock performance. Nobody is feeling anything. Nobody is seeing anything. Now consider what happens when you say, "I want to tell you about a Monday morning in 2009, when a CEO named Margaret walked into a boardroom of 11 men, set a single sheet of paper on the table, and said 4 words that would change every career in that room." Every brain in the room immediately begins generating images. They can see the boardroom. They can feel the tension. They are asking, what were the 4 words? You have opened a loop. You have activated the imaginative mind. And now, when you eventually make your point about diversity and performance, it will land not as a statistic to be evaluated, but as an insight to be felt, because you have delivered it through a story that their own brain helped construct. That is a completely different kind of persuasion. That is a beginning of hypnotic speaking. There is a concept in psychology called neural coupling, discovered by researcher Yuri Hassan at Princeton University, and it might be the single most important piece of science in this entire book. Hassan's team used fMRI scanners to measure brain activity in both speakers and listeners during communication. What they found was remarkable. When a speaker tells a story with genuine emotional engagement, the listener's brain begins to synchronize with the speaker's brain. Not metaphorically, literally, the same regions of the brain light up in the same sequence. The listener's brain begins to mirror the speaker's brain. Hassan called this neural coupling. And the degree of coupling he measured directly predicted how well the listener understood and remembered what the speaker said. The speakers who produced the strongest neural coupling were not the ones with the most impressive slides or the most polished delivery. They were the ones who spoke with genuine personal investment, who had actually felt the story they were telling. This is why authenticity is not just a nice to have in public speaking. It is a neurological mechanism through which your message transfers from your mind to another person's mind. You cannot fake neural coupling, but you can cultivate it. Now let's talk about the part of the brain that is working against you before you even open your mouth. Neuroscientists sometimes call it the amygdala hijack, the moment when the brain's threat detection system overrides rational thought and floods the body with stress hormones. Your audience is doing this to you, yes, but your audience is also doing it to themselves in a subtler way the moment you stand up to speak. Human beings are wired for social threat detection. When a stranger stands up in front of a group and begins trying to influence how that group thinks and feels, a part of every listener's brain sends out a quiet alarm. Be careful. Assess this person. Do not be fooled. This is a wall of resistance that every speaker must deal with, and most speakers try to punch through with authority, credentials, and overwhelming evidence. Hypnotic speakers do something far more elegant. They don't fight the wall. They dissolve it. They dissolve it with vulnerability, with humor, with a moment of self-exposure, so genuine that the audience's threat detection system simply switches off, because you cannot simultaneously feel connected to someone and feel threatened by them. The most powerful opening move a speaker can make is not to establish authority. It is to establish humanity. Here is a technique you can use immediately, built directly on this neuroscience. It is called the mirror moment, and it works like this. Within the first 60 seconds of any talk, share something about yourself that the audience can recognize in themselves. Not an impressive achievement, not a credential, a moment of doubt, confusion, failure, longing, or fear that is so specific and so human that it makes someone in the third row think, I have felt exactly that. A speaker who opens with, I have 3 PhDs and have spent 20 years researching this topic, has triggered threat detection and social comparison in every person in the room. A speaker who opens with, 6 years ago I stood in a room very much like this one, about to give the most important presentation of my career, and I went completely blank, not a single word. For 11 seconds it felt like 11 years has done something different entirely. That speaker has made the audience feel safe. They have sent a signal that says, I am one of you. What happened to me has happened to you. What I learned might help you too. The wall is down. The channel is open. Now you can begin. The last concept in this chapter is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all, and it has to do with the speed of trust. Research on first impressions consistently shows that audiences form their foundational judgment of a speaker not from what the speaker says, but from how the speaker enters the space. The first 7 seconds before a word is spoken account for a disproportionate amount of the audience's initial emotional positioning toward you. What they are reading in those 7 seconds is not your outfit or your hair. They are reading your relationship with yourself. They are asking, an almost unconscious level, does this person believe in what they are about to say? Is this person present, or are they somewhere else? There is a simple but transformative practice that hypnotic speakers use in those 7 seconds. They pause. They stand still. They make genuine eye contact with one person in the room. Not a sweeping scan, but a real, settled, momentary connection. And they breathe. They do not rush. They do not launch. They simply arrive fully before they begin. That pause, which feels to a nervous speaker like an eternity, reads to an audience as profound confidence. It says without a single word, I am not afraid of this silence. I own this room, and what I am about to tell you is worth waiting for. The audience leans, and before you have spoken a syllable, the hypnosis has already begun. Chapter 2, The Story Engine, How to Build Narratives that Rewire Beliefs. Every culture that has ever existed on this planet has told stories. Not some cultures. Every single one. Before writing, before cities, before agriculture, human beings sat together in the dark and told each other what happened. They told stories about hunts and storms and betrayals and miracles. They told stories to explain where the sun went at night and why the river flooded in spring. They told stories to pass survival knowledge from one generation to the next, encoded not in dry instruction, but in dramatic, memorable, emotionally charged narrative. The reason they did this, the reason we have always done this, is not sentimental. It is structural. The human brain does not store information in folders like a computer. It stores information in narrative sequences. What happened, then what happened, then what happened, and what it meant. Story is not a delivery mechanism for information. Story is the architecture of human memory itself. When you speak in stories, you are not decorating your message. You are delivering it in the only format the brain was built to permanently receive. The neuroscience behind this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it will change the way you think about every presentation you ever give. When a listener hears a fact, a statistic, a definition, a logical argument, two areas of their brain activate. Wernicke's area, which processes language, and Broca's area, which processes syntax. Two regions. The information is received, cataloged, and almost immediately begins a slow fade toward forgetting. Studies on memory retention show that pure factual information, without narrative context, is forgotten by approximately 70% of listeners within 24 hours. 70%. Think about the last conference you attended. How much do you actually remember what the speakers said? Now think about a story someone told you 10 years ago that you can still recall in vivid detail. The contrast is not coincidence. When a listener hears a story, not 2 but 7 distinct regions of the brain activate simultaneously. The motor cortex fires because the brain is simulating the physical actions in the narrative. The sensory cortex fires because the brain is generating the smells, textures, and sounds of the scene. The limbic system fires, generating actual emotions. The hippocampus encodes the experience as if it happened to the listener personally. A story, neurologically speaking, is not something you hear. It is something you live through in a compressed and vivid simulation running entirely inside your own head. This is why you remember it. But here is where most speakers go wrong with storytelling. They think a story is simply a sequence of events. Something happened, then something else happened, then something else happened, and eventually there was a conclusion. This is not a story. This is a chronicle. And chronicles, however detailed and accurate, produce almost none of the neurological effects we just described. A story requires one specific ingredient that a chronicle lacks, and that ingredient is want. A character must want something. Specifically, they must want something and face an obstacle that makes getting uncertain. The moment you introduce want plus obstacle, the listener's brain engages its predictive processing system in a completely different gear. It is no longer passively recording. It is actively participating, running simulations, generating hypotheses, emotionally investing in the outcome. Aristotle identified this over 2,000 years ago when he described drama as a character moving from one condition to another through conflict. He didn't have fMRI machines, but he was describing the same neurological mechanism that Hassan would measure at Princeton 23 centuries later. The most sophisticated storytelling insight in human history turns out to be remarkably simple. Someone wants something, something gets in the way. We watch what they do next. Let's make this concrete with a technique called the 3-room story structure, which you can apply to any narrative in any speech within minutes of learning it. The first room is a world before. You establish the context, the character, the specific sensory details that make the scene real and immediate. Not, a man walked into a building, but David, who had not slept in 31 hours, pushed open the glass doors of the bank at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, still wearing the shirt he'd had on since Sunday. The listener is now in a room. They can see it. The second room is a collision, the moment when what the character wants meets the obstacle that threatens it. This is where the emotional engine ignites. This is where the open loop forms. David has 30 minutes to secure a loan before the court ruling that will end his company. The loan officer is looking at the wrong file. David's phone is dead and his business partner is standing outside with information that could change everything. But David can't leave the desk without losing his place in the queue. The listener's nervous system is now running exactly the same stress response it would run if they were David. Their cortisol is slightly elevated. Their attention is locked. The third room is a resolution and the turn, not just what happened, but what it revealed. What did this experience expose about human nature, about the problem you're here to solve, about the idea you want your audience to carry home? The resolution is where you pivot from story to insight, and when you do it correctly, when the insight emerges from the story rather than being bolted onto it afterward, the audience doesn't feel taught. They feel like they figured it out themselves. And an insight that feels self-discovered is 1,000 times more persuasive than an insight that is delivered. There is a particular species of story that works with almost supernatural effectiveness in a public speaking context, and it is called the crucible story. A crucible, in metallurgy, is a container in which intense heat transforms raw material into something new. A crucible story is a narrative about a moment in your own life when intense pressure transformed your understanding of something fundamental. It might be a failure so complete that it forced you to rebuild your assumptions from scratch. It might be a loss that cracked you open and let in a light you hadn't known was missing. It might be a moment of unexpected grace, a stranger who said something, a book that fell open to the right page, a conversation that rearranged your interior world. The crucible story works for 3 reasons that are worth naming. First, it is inherently dramatic. By definition, it contains want, obstacle, and transformation. Second, it establishes the speaker as someone who has actually inhabited the knowledge they are sharing, not just read about it. Third, it creates the most powerful form of the neural couple we discussed in Chapter 1, because the audience recognizes in your crucible the shape of their own crucibles. You are not telling them your story. You are giving them a mirror for their own. Brené Brown, the researcher and speaker whose TED Talk on vulnerability has been watched over 60 million times, built her entire public career on one crucible story. The story of having a breakdown in a therapist's office that she initially called a spiritual awakening because she couldn't bear to call it what it was. That single moment of raw self-exposure, told with precision and humor and exactly the right amount of detail, created neural coupling with millions of people simultaneously. This is a power available to any speaker willing to go there. Now, let's talk about the part of storytelling that almost nobody teaches: the sensory anchor. The sensory anchor is a specific, concrete, physical detail inserted into a story at precisely the moment of highest emotional intensity. It is a detail that the listener's brain grabs hold of and uses to reconstruct the entire emotional experience later, sometimes years later. Think about the stories you remember most vividly from your own life. Odds are there is a sensory detail at the center of each one. The smell of a specific perfume that reminds you of someone you loved. The sound of a particular song that takes you instantly back to a single summer. The texture of a worn wooden chair in your grandfather's kitchen. These details are not decorative. They are neurological anchors. Physical sensory data attached to emotional states, stored in the brain with extraordinary durability because the hippocampus and the amygdala are physically adjacent and their encoding processes are deeply intertwined. When you are building a story for speech, ask yourself, what is the one specific sensory detail that, if I include it, will allow my listener's brain to reconstruct this entire experience on demand? It might be the exact temperature of a room, the specific sound a door made when it closed, the weight of a document in your hands, the color of the light through a window at a particular hour. Find that detail and place it at the peak of the story's emotional arc, and you'll just build a retrieval queue that will still be functioning in your listener's memory in a decade. One of the most underused storytelling techniques in public speaking is what screenwriters call the false resolution, a moment in a story where things appear to be resolved, only to have the ground shift underneath you again. Alfred Hitchcock, who understood human attention as well as anyone who has ever lived, called this the bomb under the table principle. If 2 people are sitting at a table talking and suddenly a bomb explodes, you have given the audience 15 seconds of surprise. But if the camera shows the audience the bomb under the table before the 2 characters know it's there, and then we watch those characters have their ordinary conversation, every word they say becomes unbearable with tension. You just bought yourself 15 minutes of sustained, intense engagement from the same material that would otherwise produce 15 seconds of reaction. In speech terms, this means that when you tell a story, you can dramatically increase its impact by letting the audience know that something is about to go wrong before the character does. You say, What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't possibly have known at that moment, sitting there feeling like everything was finally working out, was that the phone call that would change everything had already been made. Now the audience is living inside the dramatic irony. They know something is coming. They are watching your past self with a kind of tender dread. And that dread is the most compelling emotional state you can create in a listener, because it combines empathy with suspense in a ratio that is almost impossible to look away from. Let's address something that stops many speakers from using stories at all. The fear of being too personal, too vulnerable, too much. There is a calibration required here that is worth discussing honestly. The goal of a personal story in a speech is not catharsis. You are not in therapy. You are not asking the audience to carry your emotional weight. The goal is transference. You go into the difficult experience, you extract the insight that lives inside it, and you deliver that insight in a form that is useful to the people in the room. The rule that hypnotic speakers follow is this: be specific about the experience and universal about the meaning. The specific details make the story vivid and real. The universal meaning makes it relevant to every person in the room. A speaker who says, "I went through a divorce and it was very hard," has been vulnerable in the least useful way. Generic, shapeless, asking for sympathy without offering anything in return. A speaker who says, "I remember the exact moment I realized I've been performing the role of husband for 3 years instead of actually being one. I was sitting in traffic listening to a voicemail from my wife, and I caught myself planning how to respond before I'd even finished listening. And I thought, when did I stop actually hearing her?" That speaker has been vulnerable in the way that creates connection. The detail is specific enough to be real. The insight that we perform relationships instead of inhabiting them is universal enough to land in every heart in the room. The last technique in this chapter is one that will immediately distinguish you from 95% of speakers you will ever share a stage with, and it involves how you end a story. Most speakers end their stories with the lesson. They tell the story and then they explain what it means, as if the audience cannot be trusted to feel the meaning themselves. This is the equivalent of telling a joke and then explaining why it was funny. Hypnotic speakers end their stories one emotional beat before the lesson, and then they pause. They let the silence hold the weight of what just happened. They let the audience's own minds reach toward the meaning, touch it, and claim it as their own. Because here is the deepest truth about persuasion that this book has to offer, and we might as well name it here in Chapter 2, since everything else builds on it. People do not believe ideas they are given. They believe ideas they arrive at. Your job as a hypnotic speaker is not to pour your conclusions into empty vessels. It is to construct an experience so precisely, so deliberately, so skillfully, that the people in the room cannot help but walk themselves to the edge of the insight and step over on their own. The story is not the message. The story is the path. And the best paths are the ones that make the traveler feel, upon arrival, that they found the destination themselves. Chapter 3. The voice as an instrument, silence, rhythm, and the sound of conviction. There is a recording that communication researchers at UCLA played to test subjects in the 1980s, and the results were so counterintuitive that they have been debated, replicated, and cited in virtually every book about public speaking ever written since. The researchers took an actor and had him deliver the exact same sentence, "I am going to the store," in 37 different ways, varying only the vocal qualities: pitch, pace, volume, rhythm, pause, and breath. 37 identical sentences, 37 completely different meanings. Listeners consistently identified the emotional content of each delivery with startling accuracy, even when the sentence itself was perfectly neutral. What the research confirmed was something that great speakers, great actors, and great seducers have always known intuitively. The words you choose carry perhaps 20 to 30% of your message. The rest, the majority, the overwhelming majority, travels through the sound of your voice. Not what you say, how it sounds when you say it. If you have been spending 90% of your preparation time on the content of your speech and almost none of it on the instrument through which that content travels, you have been preparing the wrong thing. The first element of vocal mastery that separates hypnotic speakers from ordinary ones is the one that most people are most afraid to use. Silence. Genuine, unhurried, unapologetic silence. The pause. The average speaker is terrified of silence. They fill every gap with and so, and and the verbal equivalent of nervous pacing, because silence feels like failure to them, like they have run out of things to say, or lost their place, or given the audience permission to look away. But here is what silence actually communicates when a confident speaker uses it deliberately. It says that what just happened was important enough to let breathe. It says that what is about to happen is worth waiting for. It says, at the deepest level of nonverbal communication, that this speaker is not afraid of this room. Silence is the instrument of authority. Think of the most commanding figures you have encountered in your life. The teacher, the leader, the mentor, the executive who walked into chaos and made it still. Virtually all of them shared one vocal characteristic. They were comfortable with silence in a way that made everyone around them more comfortable too. Their pauses were not accidents. They were punctuation marks in a language most people never learn to write. There are 3 distinct types of pause that every hypnotic speaker should have in their toolkit, and they do different things with different precision. The first is the emphasis pause, a half-second to 1-second silence placed immediately after a keyword or phrase. If you say, the one thing that changed everything, and then pause before you reveal what the thing was, you have created a micro-open loop. You have also, by the simple act of stopping, told the audience that the next thing you say is worth writing down. The emphasis pause is the vocal equivalent of underlining. The second is a dramatic pause. 2 to 4 seconds of silence placed at the peak of a story's emotional arc or immediately after a shocking or surprising statement. When a speaker reveals something unexpected and then holds a silence, they are allowing the emotional resonance to spread through the room like a wave. If you keep talking immediately after your most powerful moment, you are essentially speaking over your own impact. The dramatic pause is how you get out of the way and let your best material do its work. The third is the connector pause, a 1 to 2 second silence between major sections of talk, used not for drama but for architecture. It tells the audience, what just happened is complete, and what happens next is different. It creates a sensation of chapters in a live experience, giving the audience's brain a moment to file what just occurred before opening a new folder. Now, let's talk about pace, because pace is a heartbeat of a speech, and most speakers only know one rhythm. They choose a speed, usually fast, because nervous people speak fast, and most speakers are at least a little nervous, and they maintain it for the duration. A talk delivered at a single consistent pace is like music played at a single volume, technically present, but emotionally inert. The human ear, like the human eye, is a change detection system. It is not built to monitor steady states. It is built to notice difference. The hypnotic speaker uses pace the way a jazz musician uses tempo, as an expressive instrument, constantly varied in response to the emotional content of the material. When you are building tension, when you are moving to the rising action of a story, piling detail on detail, creating urgency, you accelerate, not dramatically but noticeably. The words come a little faster. The sentences flow into each other with less gap between them, and the listener's nervous system responds to that acceleration with a slight but real increase in arousal and engagement. Then, at the moment of maximum tension, at the exact moment when the story pivots, or the insight lands, or the most important sentence arrives, you slow down, sometimes to a near crawl. You place one word in the air, and you let it settle, and then you place the next word. And the contrast between the speed that came before and the slowness that is happening now creates an effect that is almost physically striking. Listeners describe this later as the moment when time slowed down, or everything became very clear. What they experienced was a neurology of contrast, a sudden shift in stimulation that forces the brain to snap to maximum attention. Let's talk about pitch, and specifically about the phenomenon that vocal coaches call upward inflection, the habit of ending declarative sentences with a rising tone, as if every statement is a question. This pattern, sometimes called uptalk, has become endemic in modern speech, particularly among younger speakers, and particularly in environments where the speaker feels uncertain or eager to be liked. The cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker has written about how upward inflection developed as a social bonding tool, a vocal signal that says, "I am not threatening you, I am checking whether you're still with me." In small doses, in casual conversation, this is harmless and even warm, but as a dominant pattern in a presentation, it is devastating. Every time you end a sentence with an upward inflection, you are communicating uncertainty. You are asking your audience to approve of your statement before you finish making it. You are, vocally, requesting permission to exist in the room. Hypnotic speakers, almost without exception, end their important sentences with a downward inflection. The voice drops. It settles. It lands. A downward inflection at the end of the sentence says, "This is true, and I know it is true, and I am not asking whether you agree." It is a vocal expression conviction, and conviction is contagious in a way that few other things are. Practice recording yourself and listening back specifically for this. You will likely be startled by how often your voice is asking questions when your words are making statements. There is a quality in the human voice that has no precise scientific name, but that every person in every audience recognizes instantly. The quality of someone who is actually inside what they are saying. You hear it when a speaker's voice carries a slight roughness around a vulnerable moment, not from bad technique, but from genuine feeling. You hear it when the pace of a sentence slows not because the speaker rehearsed it that way, but because the memory is actually moving through them as they speak. You hear it in the breath, that slight catch before a particularly weighted sentence, the quiet exhale after something difficult is said. This quality is sometimes called resonance, and while there are physical components to vocal resonance that can be trained, the deepest form of it is not technical. It is emotional. It is a sound of a person who has not just memorized a material, but who has inhabited it, who has turned their experiences into something larger than personal history, and is sharing that larger thing with the room. You cannot manufacture this quality, but you can create the conditions for it to emerge. And the most important condition is this: never deliver a story you have not first told in private to yourself slowly, letting yourself actually feel whatever is inside it. Speakers who rehearse only performance of their material rarely sound resonant. Speakers who rehearse the experience of their material, who go back inside it before they perform it, almost always do. Let's turn now to volume, which is a far more sophisticated tool than most people treat it as. The default approach to volume in public speaking is simple. Speak loudly enough that the people in the back can hear you. This is necessary but not sufficient. What most speakers miss is that lowering the volume, strategically, can create more engagement than raising it. When a speaker drops their voice to near conversational level, in a room where people are accustomed to projected speech, something remarkable happens. The audience leans in, not metaphorically, physically. They move their bodies toward the sound, and in doing so they make a physical commitment to attention that reinforces their own engagement. There is also a psychological dimension. A speaker who drops to a near whisper is implicitly communicating that what they are about to say is something private, something not meant for everyone, something that you are lucky to be close enough to hear. You are creating the sensation of being told a secret, and human beings have a deep, ancient hunger for secrets. A secret, after all, is just a story with an access restriction, and exclusivity makes everything more compelling. Try this in your next presentation. Choose one insight, one moment, one sentence that you consider the most important thing you will say, and deliver it at 60% of your normal volume. Slower than usual. more privately than usual. Watch what the room does. Watch how the people in it reorganize themselves toward you. The rhythm of spoken language is something that great speakers understand in their bones, often without being able to articulate it consciously. What they have learned through thousands of hours of speaking and listening is that certain sentence structures create a physical, almost musical satisfaction in the listener, a sense of completion and inevitability that makes an idea feel not just true but right. The most powerful of these structures is the rule of 3. 3 is the smallest number of examples required for the human brain to perceive a pattern. 2 examples feel like a coincidence. 4 examples feel like a list. But 3 examples feel like proof, and more importantly, 3 items have a natural rhythmic arc. The first establishes, the second develops, the third lands. Think of Churchill. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields. Think of Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The antithetical structure, the rising rhythm, the landing at the end, these were not accidental choices. Churchill and Kennedy and every great orator in history understood that the relationship between the rhythm of language and the emotional response of a listener is not arbitrary. It is structural. The ear expects resolution. The brain rewards pattern. When you arrange your 3 key points in a rising rhythmic arc, with the most powerful point last and the most powerful word in that point at the very end of the sentence, you are working with the architecture of human attention rather than against it. One of the most transformative exercises you can do to develop your voice as an instrument is something that actors call text work, and it is almost embarrassingly simple. Take a single sentence, any sentence from a speech you're preparing, and deliver it 20 different ways. Change the word you emphasize each time. Change the speed. Change the volume. Change where you breathe. Change the pitch of the last word. Record every version. Then listen back and notice how radically different the same sentence in sound, how different emotions it carries, how different a relationship it creates with the listener. I never said she stole the money. Emphasize never, and it is a denial. Emphasize said, and it implies the speaker thought it, but didn't say it. Emphasize she, and it implies someone else stole it. Emphasize stole, and it implies she obtained the money through some other means. Emphasize money, and it implies something else was stolen. 7 words. 7 completely different meanings. Completely controlled by one variable, where the voice places its energy. This exercise is not just useful for technical development. It is a revelation about the nature of communication itself. A reminder that meaning is not contained in words. Meaning is created in the space between the speaker's intention and the listener's interpretation, and the voice is the primary instrument through which that space is navigated. The last thing to be said in this chapter about the voice is a thing that should perhaps have been said first, because it underlies everything else. Breath. The breath is the foundation of every vocal quality we discussed. Pause, pace, pitch, volume, resonance. A speaker who breathes shallowly from the chest under the tension of performance anxiety will struggle to access any of the vocal tools in this chapter, no matter how thoroughly they have understood them intellectually. The nervous system and the respiratory system are directly connected. Shallow, rapid breathing activates the sympathetic nervous system, which produces more anxiety, which produces more shallow breathing, which creates the vocal characteristics of fear, a thin, high, rushed, upwardly inflected voice that the audience reads in an instant as uncertainty. The antidote is not a psychological trick. It is a physiological one. Before you speak, in the 10 seconds before you open your mouth, in that pause we discussed, breathe from the diaphragm, fill the lungs from the bottom up, allowing the belly to expand. Hold for 2 seconds. Release slowly. This single act sends a direct signal to the parasympathetic nervous system. You are safe. You are present. You are ready. The voice that emerges from a diaphragmatic breath is fuller, lower, slower, and more certain than the voice that emerges from a chest breath. Not because you have changed your psychology, because you have changed your chemistry. The audience will hear the difference before they can name it, and what they will hear is the sound of someone who has arrived. Chapter 4. Language that bypasses resistance. The hidden architecture of persuasive words. There is a moment in every persuasion attempt, every sales pitch, every argument, every speech, when the listener's mind makes a decision that the speaker almost never sees happening. It is not the decision to agree or disagree. It comes earlier than that, and it is more fundamental. It is a decision to open or to close, to lower the drawbridge or to raise it. And this decision is made not by the rational, conscious mind that evaluates logic and evidence, but by a much older, much faster, much less articulate part of the brain that is scanning the speaker's words for a very specific set of signals. The signals it is looking for are threat signals, linguistic patterns that trigger the brain's defensive architecture, that cause the listener to cross their arms, not just physically but cognitively, and begin the process of building counterarguments. And the signals it relaxes in response to are something else entirely. Patterns of language that feel like invitation rather than instruction, like exploration rather than pressure, like something happening with the listener rather than to them. The difference between these two categories of language is not a matter of politeness or tone. It is a matter of neurological precision. And once you learn to see it, you will never hear a speech or a conversation the same way again. Let's begin with the most fundamental principle of language that bypasses resistance, which Milton Erickson, a psychiatrist widely considered the greatest hypnotherapist of the 20th century, spent a lifetime refining, and which has since migrated from the therapy room into the world's most effective boardrooms, courtrooms, and stages. Erickson noticed that the conscious, critical mind has a limited bandwidth. It can only evaluate a certain number of inputs at once before it becomes cognitively occupied, engaged, busy, working on one thing, which means it is simultaneously less available to resist another thing. He called this utilization, and the linguistic expression of it is what has become known as the double bind, a construction that offers the listener a choice between two options, both of which lead to the same destination. A parent who says to a reluctant child, "Would you like to start your homework before dinner or after dinner?" is not asking whether the homework will happen. The homework is already decided. The question is about when, and by offering the choice of when, the parent has made the fact of homework feel like an expression of the child's own agency. A speaker who says, "Whether this idea excites you immediately or whether it takes a few days to fully land, I think you'll find that," has done the same thing. The listener's mind is offered a choice, immediate excitement or delayed appreciation. And while it is processing that choice, the main message slides through. This is not manipulation in any dark sense. It is simply speaking in alignment with how human beings actually process decisions. There is a category of language that Erickson's students eventually codified into a system called the Milton model, and the elements of it that are most directly applicable to public speaking are worth examining one by one, because each one's a precision tool that does a different job. The first is what linguists call a presupposition, a statement that assumes rather than argues for a particular reality. The difference between "I think you might find this useful" and "as you begin to find this useful, you'll notice" is not subtle. The first statement is making a claim that the listener is free to evaluate and reject. The second statement has already assumed the finding useful and is now discussing what happens during it, which means the listener's critical mind has to work backwards, upstream against the current of the sentence, to challenge the assumption. Most minds don't bother. They accept the presupposed reality and move on to the part of the sentence that is explicitly available for processing. Great advertisers have known this for decades. When did you first realize you needed better skin care is a more effective question than "Do you need better skin care?" because it presupposes a need and asks only about timing. In a speech, presuppositions are extraordinarily powerful when used to presuppose engagement, understanding, or transformation, As you sit with this idea over the next few days, assumes they will sit with it. The moment you try this in your own presentation, assumes they will try it. You are not asking whether. You are discussing when and how and what will feel like, and the listener's imagination, obedient and generous, begins constructing exactly the future you described. The second element is what Erickson called pacing and leading, perhaps the most elegant persuasion structure in the entire vocabulary of hypnotic language. Pacing means making statements about the listener's current experience that they cannot disagree with, statements so obviously true that the critical mind has no grounds on which to object. Leading means once you have established a chain of accepted truths, adding a new statement to the end of that chain, a statement that you want the listener to accept in the hope that the momentum of agreement will carry them through the turn. A simple example, stripped to its bones, would sound like this. You are sitting in a room. You are listening to a speaker. Some part of you is remembering why you came today. And as you remember that, you can begin to feel that this information is exactly what you were looking for. The first three sentences are inarguable. The listener is sitting, listening, and presumably has a reason for being there. By the time the fourth sentence arrives, the listener is already in a rhythm of internal agreement, and that rhythm makes the fourth statement, which is the actual message, the one that would face resistance if delivered cold, far more likely be received as true. Political speechwriters use this structure constantly. It is why effective speeches almost always begin by naming the audience's experience, their frustrations, their hopes, their daily realities, before introducing any new idea. The audience thinks they are being understood. They are also being led. Now let's talk about metaphor, because metaphor is not a decorative element of language. Metaphor is a cognitive technology, a way of using a structure the listener already understands to carry a new concept that they don't yet have the internal architecture to hold. When Elon Musk calls his battery company Tesla rather than Advanced Energy Storage Incorporated, he is doing something linguistically precise. He is borrowing the existing emotional resonance of a historical genius and attaching it to a new idea. When Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream," rather than "I have a policy proposal," he translated a political argument into an image, and images bypass the critical mind in a way that arguments almost never can. The cognitive scientist George Lakoff spent decades demonstrating that we do not think about abstract concepts directly. We think about them through the medium of physical, embodied metaphors. We understand time as a path we walk along. We understand arguments as buildings. We build arguments, we shore them up, we say the foundation is weak. We understand the mind as a container. We pour ideas in. We can't get something out of our heads. Our minds are full. These are not poetic flourishes. They are the actual cognitive structures through which abstract reality becomes thinkable. When you choose your metaphors carefully, when you describe your company's growth not as increasing market share, but as roots going deep enough to survive the drought, you are not decorating your message. You are determining how your message will be stored and retrieved in the listener's brain. The metaphor is the filing system. Choose it deliberately. One of the most powerful language patterns available to a speaker is what NLP practitioners call the artfully vague statement, a sentence that is constructed with enough openness that every listener fills it with their own most personally relevant meaning. Milton Erickson was a master of this in therapy. He would say things like, "At some point, perhaps sooner than you expect, you will notice a change that feels important to you." A statement so carefully nonspecific that it could mean virtually anything, and therefore meant something profound to virtually everyone. In speech, the artfully vague statement works because audiences are not homogeneous. The person in the front row may have come to learn how to handle boardroom presentations. The person in the middle may be trying to save a failing marriage through better communication. The person in the back may be a 17-year-old who followed someone else in from the lobby. When you say, "There is someone in this room who has been carrying a story about themselves that was never true," that is an artfully vague statement. Almost every person in the room will believe privately that it is about them, and each one will fill in the blank with whatever their particular untrue story is. You have created a moment of intensely personal connection with dozens of people simultaneously, without knowing anything specific about any of them. This is not a trick. It is a recognition that the deepest human experiences, doubt, longing, the gap between who we are and who we want to be, are universal enough that pointing in their general direction will find a mark in every heart in the room. There's a word that more public speaking coaches should warn against, and that word is but. The word but is a cognitive eraser. Whatever comes before it is psychologically nullified by whatever comes after it. You've done great work this quarter, but I need us to talk about your time management. The praise before the but is gone the moment the but arrives. The listener heard, I need us to talk about your time management. Every cell in their body knows this, and yet speakers deploy but constantly, believing that the positive statement before it is somehow building goodwill that will survive the negation. It doesn't. The hypnotic alternative is, and you've done great work this quarter, and I want us to build on that momentum by looking at your time management. Now the two statements are additive rather than adversarial. The listener's brain is not forced to choose between them. They can hold both simultaneously. Similarly, the word try is a word that programs failure. When you say, I'll try to explain this clearly, you've already told the listener's unconscious mind that clarity is a goal you are uncertain of reaching. Erickson famously demonstrated this in therapy by asking patients to try to lift their arm, and then pointing out that they were either lifting it or not lifting it, and there was no separate action called trying. In a speech context, replace I want to try to show you with I'm going to show you. Replace I think this might be helpful with this is going to be useful. The difference is the difference between asking for permission to communicate and simply communicating. The question is perhaps the most hypnotic device in the entire language toolkit, and it is almost universally underused in public speaking, because most speakers think of questions as requests for information. But a question does something far more important than request information. It activates the listener's mind. When you ask a question, any question, the listener's brain immediately and involuntarily begins formulating an answer. This is not a choice they make. It is a reflex, as automatic as a knee-jerk response to a doctor's hammer. This means that a question is the most reliable tool available to a speaker for transforming passive listening into active participation. What would it mean for you if you could walk into any room and instantly command attention? It is not really asking for a specific answer. It is inviting the listener's brain to construct an internal movie, to imagine the feeling, to project themselves into scenario, to feel in advance what is being promised. Rhetorical questions do this at scale, across an entire room simultaneously. But there is an even more sophisticated use of questions in hypnotic speaking, which is the embedded question, a question that is grammatically nested inside a statement, so that it bypasses a critical filter while still activating the imaginative process. I wonder what it will be like for you when you first use this technique in a real situation. It is not grammatically a question you are expected to answer aloud, but your brain answers it silently, automatically, vividly, and in doing so, it has already begun the process of believing that using the technique is a foregone conclusion. Language researchers have identified a specific category of words that reliably increase engagement and memorability across virtually all contexts, and you will recognize them the moment they are named. Words that suggest immediacy, exclusivity, specificity, and sensory experience. Words like suddenly, secret, exactly, imagine, discover, you, and new have been shown in study after study to activate the brain's attention systems with unusual reliability. The word "you" is particularly interesting. Research by cognitive neuroscientist Diana Tamir at Harvard found that talking about ourselves activates the same reward circuitry in the brain as food and money. When a speaker says "you," when they speak directly and personally to the listener rather than about some abstract audience, they are giving the listener a tiny neurological reward with every sentence. They are saying implicitly, "This is not general information. This is specifically for you. This is about your life." The speaker who says, "People often struggle with fear before a presentation," has described a phenomenon. The speaker who says, "You know that specific feeling right before you're about to speak, when your mouth goes dry and you can hear your own heartbeat," has entered the listener's private experience and made them feel genuinely seen. The second speaker is not more informative. They are more intimate. And intimacy at scale, across a room full of strangers, is the alchemy at the heart of hypnotic communication. Let us end this chapter with the most powerful sentence structure in the English language for bypassing resistance and planting ideas, which is because construction. The social psychologist Ellen Langer ran a now famous study in which a researcher tried to cut in line at a copy machine. In the first condition, the researcher simply said, "Excuse me, may I use the Xerox machine?" 60% of people agreed. In the second condition, the researcher said, "Excuse me, may I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush?" 94% agreed. What is extraordinary is what happened in the third condition. "Excuse me, may I use the Xerox machine because I need to make copies?" The compliance rate was 93%, almost identical to the in a rush condition. The reason given in condition 3 is not actually a reason at all. Everyone at a copy machine needs to make copies, but the word "because," the fact that a reason structure was present, regardless of the reason's actual merit, triggered an automatic compliance response in the listener's brain. The brain, operating on deep habit, hears because and responds as if a valid justification has been offered, even when the justification is empty. In speech, the because construction is a golden tool, not for offering empty reasons, but for connecting every request you make your audience to a clearly articulated benefit. Take out your phone and write this down, because this is the one technique you'll use more than any other is not the same sentence as "take out your phone and write this down." The second sentence is an instruction. The first sentence is an invitation that comes with a reason to accept it, and the human brain, social and reciprocal and always scanning for meaning, responds to an invitation with a reason far more willingly than it responds to an instruction alone. This is not manipulation. This is speaking to human beings as they actually are, not as rational information processing machines, but as feeling, meaning-making, deeply social creatures who are always asking, beneath every surface interaction, one fundamental question: why does this matter to me? Your job as a hypnotic speaker is to always have the answer ready. Chapter 5. Reading and Moving the Room. The live intelligence of a hypnotic speaker. There is a distinction that separates truly extraordinary speakers from very good ones, and it has nothing to do with preparation. It has nothing to do with the quality of their material, the elegance of their language, or the power of their voice. It is something that happens in real time, invisibly continuously, throughout every moment they are standing in front of an audience. The extraordinary speaker is always doing two things simultaneously. They are delivering their prepared content, and they are reading. They are reading the room the way a jazz musician reads the other players, not just executing what was rehearsed, but listening, adjusting, responding, improvising within structure. They notice the woman in the fourth row whose eyes have just gone slightly distant. They notice the cluster of people near the window who have begun exchanging small glances with each other. They notice the quality of the silence has changed, that it is no longer the leaning in silence of engagement, but the polite, slightly glazed silence of an audience that is present in body, but has quietly departed in mind. And they do something about it immediately without breaking the surface of the talk, so seamlessly that the audience never knows a correction was made. This capacity to receive real-time feedback from a live room and respond to it with precision is what transforms a speech from a performance into a conversation. And it is entirely learnable if you know what to look for. The first thing to understand about reading a room is that an audience communicates constantly and almost never verbally. What they are speaking in is a language of the body, a language so old and so automatic that most people produce it without any awareness that they're doing it at all. The body does not lie in a way that words can lie, which is precisely why learning to read it gives you access to information that the audience itself may not consciously possess. The single most reliable signal of genuine engagement is what researchers call postural synchrony, the phenomenon where an engaged audience begins to unconsciously mirror each other's and the speaker's body positions. When you look out at a room where people are leaning forward at roughly similar angles, with similar degrees of stillness, you are looking at a room in a shared state. Their nervous systems have begun to synchronize, which is exactly the neural couple we discussed in Chapter 1 happening at visible, physical scale. Conversely, when you see a room full of asymmetric postures, people leaning different ways, shifting in their seats, crossing and uncrossing their legs with frequency, you're looking at a room of independent nervous systems, each running its own private program, each only partially present with you. This is your diagnostic signal, not an emergency, but information, the same information a doctor reads from a patient's vital signs before deciding what to do next. Let us go further into the specific signals, because precision matters here. Genuine, deep engagement produces a very particular cluster of physical behaviors that you can learn to recognize from a stage at 30 feet. The head is slightly forward. The blink rate decreases. When human beings are genuinely absorbed in something, they blink less, as if the brain is rationing the milliseconds of darkness it allows itself. The hands are still or lightly resting. The mouth is slightly open, not dramatically, but with the jaw relaxed rather than set. The body's overall orientation is toward the speaker even if the posture is relaxed. You will also notice, in a deeply engaged room, a peculiar stillness in the throat. People are not swallowing frequently, not clearing their throats, not making small involuntary sounds that a distracted or mildly anxious nervous system produces. When you see this cluster across a majority of the room, you are in the zone. What you do in this moment is perhaps counterintuitive. You do less. You slow down. You lower your volume slightly. You trust the engagement and stop working so hard to create it. Because the most common mistake speakers make when they find they have a room in their grip is to become so excited by the engagement that they accelerate, add more, push harder, and in doing so, they break the spell they worked so hard to cast. The signals of disengagement are equally specific and equally important to recognize quickly. The most obvious is the phone. When someone pulls out their phone, the battle for that person's attention is not necessarily lost, but the clock has started. More subtle and more diagnostic is the chin drop. When a listener's chin drops toward their chest, it signals that they have moved from outward focus engagement to inward focus rumination. They are thinking about something other than what you are saying. More subtle still is the micro-expression of evaluation, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible pull at the corners of the mouth that appears on faces when listeners are actively generating counterarguments. This is actually a less dangerous signal than it looks, because it means a person is still engaged enough to disagree with you. The most dangerous signal is the one that looks peaceful, the slightly unfocused gaze, the chin resting in the hand, the body turned ever so slightly sideways from you. This is not disagreement. This is departure. The person has left the building while leaving their body behind as a courtesy. When you see this spreading through a room, and it spreads like a contagion, because attention states are socially contagious, you have approximately 60 to 90 seconds before the collective energy of the room begins to pull other people with it. You need to change something immediately, and you need to know what to change. The toolkit for re-engaging a drifting room is more varied and more elegant than most speakers realize, and the first rule of deploying it is this: never let your intervention show. The moment an audience senses that you have noticed their disengagement and are scrambling to recover it, two things happen simultaneously, both of them bad. First, they feel guilty, which generates a low-grade resentment. Second, they become aware of their own disengagement, which paradoxically deepens it. Consciousness of an attention is its own distraction. The interventions at work are the ones that feel, from the audience's perspective, like natural progressions in the talk rather than course corrections. The most powerful of these is the pattern interrupt, a sudden, deliberate change in any element of your communication that is sufficiently unexpected to snap the brain's attention system back online. Remember that the brain is a change detection system, and that sustained stimulation at a consistent level will always produce habituation, the neurological equivalent of the eye adjusting to a bright light until it no longer notices the brightness. A pattern interrupt works by giving the change detection system exactly what it evolved to respond to, something different. This can be a change in volume, suddenly dropping to near silence in the middle of a sentence where the audience expected normal projection. It can be a change in physical position, moving from behind the lectern to the front of the stage, or stepping off the stage entirely. It can be a change in the form of communication, from monologue to direct question, from abstract argument to physical demonstration, from serious to unexpectedly funny. It can even be a deliberate pause, longer than comfortable, which allows the room's ambient noise and the audience's awareness of the silence to do the work of refocusing for you. The question is the most versatile re-engagement tool in a speaker's arsenal, and it works on two levels simultaneously. At the obvious level, a direct question, how many of you have experienced something like this? Creates a moment of active participation that breaks the passivity of listening and requires the audience to make a visible, physical response. The act of raising a hand is a small commitment, and commitment, as Robert Cialdini demonstrated in decades of research on influence, is self-reinforcing. People who have made a public gesture of agreement are more likely to continue agreeing than people who haven't. At a deeper level, any question activates the listener's brain in a reflexive, involuntary way we discussed in Chapter 4. The brain cannot not answer a question, and in the process of formulating an answer, even silently, the audience member has become cognitively active again rather than passively drifting. The most skilled speakers use questions not just as re-engagement tools, but as continuous threading devices. They weave questions throughout a talk like stitches through fabric, creating a texture of ongoing participation that never allows the audience to settle fully into passive reception. Does that resonate with what you've seen? How would that change things for you? What would need to be true for that to work in your situation? These questions don't require spoken answers. They require internal answers, and internal answers are the closest thing to genuine thinking that a speaker can produce in a listener who is sitting still. There's a phenomenon that every experienced speaker encounters, and that almost nobody teaches explicitly: the energy dip after the midpoint. In virtually every talk of 30 minutes or longer, there's a window of approximately 5 to 8 minutes that begins just after the halfway mark, where the room's collective energy noticeably drops. This is not a reflection of the quality of the content. It is a predictable feature of human attentional biology, what chronobiologists call the ultradian rhythm, a 90-minute cycle of alertness and rest that runs continuously through the human nervous system throughout the day. The midpoint of a long talk often coincides with the rest phase of the cycle, and the effect on an audience can look disconcertingly like mass disenchantment even when nothing has gone wrong. Knowing this in advance changes everything. rather than responding to the midpoint dip with anxiety and overcompensation. Hypnotic speakers build what they call a reignition moment into the structure of their talk just after the halfway mark, a story with an unexpected turn, a striking visual, a moment of genuine humor, a physical activity, a revelation that reframes everything that came before it. This is not a random energizer. It is a structurally placed defibrillator, time for exactly the moment when the collective heart of the room needs a shock to keep beating at full strength. Let's talk about laughter, because humor in public speaking is one of the most misunderstood and most feared elements of the craft, and it deserves more serious attention than it usually gets. Most speakers either avoid humor entirely because they are afraid of silence where they expected a laugh, or they use it formulaically, slotting in a joke at the beginning as if warming up a crowd is a box to be checked before the real work begins. Neither approach understands what laughter actually does in a room, which is this. It resets the nervous system. A genuine laugh, not a polite smile, but a real physical laugh, produces a measurable spike in endorphins and a corresponding reduction in cortisol. For approximately 90 seconds after a genuine laugh, the audience is more open, more trusting, more neurologically receptive than they were before it. The laugh is not a break from persuasion. The laugh is the most efficient persuasion reset button you have. Furthermore, laughter is a social bonding mechanism of extraordinary power. Shared laughter between strangers creates a temporary tribe, a sense of collective identity, an us that includes the speaker and the audience together rather than positioning the speaker above or apart from the audience. The speaker who can make a room laugh is not just likable. They are trusted in the deep, neurological way that trust forms between members of the same group. The key to humor in a speech that actually works, as opposed to humor that dies in the silence of a room that didn't get there, is not joke writing skill. It is specificity. The most reliable form of humor in public speaking is the true, specific, self-deprecating story that the audience can recognize. Not a setup and a punchline, but a detailed account of a moment when you were wrong, confused, embarrassed, or magnificently foolish in a way that is simultaneously particular to you and universal in its human shape. The reason specificity is so important is that the brain's humor response is triggered by incongruity, the gap between what is expected and what is delivered. Generic humor produces a generic incongruity that the brain has usually already processed through exposure to similar jokes. But a specific, personal story contains incongruities that are genuinely new, genuinely surprising, because they emerge from the unpredictable particulars of a real life. When the comedian Mike Birbiglia describes the specific, absurd details of his sleepwalking disorder, not, I have a medical condition that is sometimes funny, but the precise, bizarre, hilarious specifics of jumping through a second-floor hotel window while dreaming he was evading a guided missile. The laughter is not a response to the joke. It is a response to genuine surprise, which is the purest form of humor there is. One of the most sophisticated live room skills a speaker can develop is what theatrical directors call triangulation, the art of managing the physical and psychological geometry of your relationship to the audience in real time. Where you stand in relation to your audience carries meaning that operates entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness, but is registered powerfully by the group nonetheless. Standing behind a lectern signals authority and separation. You are the expert, they are the recipients. Moving in front of the lectern signals openness and equality. Stepping to one side of the stage and speaking from there for several minutes creates a subtle intimacy with the people on that side, while the other side begins to feel slightly peripheral, a useful technique when you want to create the sensation of speaking privately to individuals within a group. Moving to the opposite side reestablishes a connection with the other half of the room. Moving toward the audience during a vulnerable or intimate moment creates physical intimacy that amplifies the emotional content of what is being said. Moving away during a moment of empowerment or challenge creates space for the audience to feel the weight of the idea without the speaker's physical presence mediating it. These movements are not choreography. They are spatial language, and they are being read and interpreted by the audience with the same unconscious precision with which they read your facial expressions. The last and most advanced skill in reading a room is also the most difficult to teach, because it lives in a dimension that most technical instruction cannot easily reach. It is a skill of presence, of being so fully, completely, undistractedly in the room with the audience that your nervous system and their nervous system enter into genuine dialogue, not performance of presence, not the simulation of eye contact and attentive nodding, actual unguarded, open presence, the kind where you are genuinely moved by what moves a room, genuinely amused by what amuses them, genuinely affected by the weight of what you are asking them to consider. This quality is detectable by an audience at ranges and under conditions that defy easy explanation. Audiences in the back row of a 2,000-person theater report feeling that a truly present speaker was speaking directly to them. Audiences watching recordings of truly present speakers report feeling connection through a screen with someone they have never met and who has no knowledge of their existence. This is neural coupling operating at its maximum power, a speaker so fully inhabited by their own material, so completely available to the room they are in, that the boundary between their internal experience and the audience's internal experience becomes genuinely permeable. You cannot manufacture this, but you can practice its prerequisites, knowing your material so deeply that you are liberated from it, caring about your audience so genuinely that you are curious about them, and being willing to be changed, actually changed, not performatively changed, by the act of sharing something true with a room full of human beings who came, at some cost of time and attention, to hear what you have to say. Chapter 6. The Body Never Lies. Physical presence as the ultimate persuasion instrument. There's an experiment that social psychologist Amy Cuddy and her colleagues at Harvard Business School ran that produced results so striking they were initially difficult to believe. Participants were asked to hold one of two physical postures for exactly 2 minutes before entering a stressful job interview. The first posture was expansive, chest open, shoulders back, feet wide, arms either raised or resting on a wide surface, the body taking up as much space as it comfortably could. The second posture was contractive, shoulders hunched, arms crossed or pulled close, legs tight together, the body making itself as small as possible. What happened inside the bodies of the participants during those 2 minutes of posture was measurable and dramatic. The expansive posture produced a 17% increase in testosterone, the hormone associated with confidence, dominance, and risk tolerance, and an 11% decrease in cortisol, the stress hormone. The contractive posture produced the opposite. Testosterone dropped, cortisol rose. 2 minutes. No word spoken, no performance given, no audience present. Simply a body arranged in space in a particular way. And that arrangement changed the speaker's hormonal reality, which changed their psychological state, which changed how they walked into the room, which changed how the interviewers experienced them. The body does not just express your internal state, it creates it. And this single insight, properly understood, rewires everything you thought you knew about preparing to speak. Most people approach the physical dimension of public speaking as a problem of aesthetics. They worry about whether their hands look strange, whether they're swaying, whether they make enough eye contact, whether their posture is professional. These concerns are not entirely wrong, but they are addressed at the wrong level, the level of appearance rather than the level of biology. What the research consistently shows is that physical behavior in front of an audience operates on 2 tracks simultaneously, and both tracks matter equally. The first track is a visible one. The audience reads your body and draws conclusions about your confidence, authority, trustworthiness, and emotional state. The second track is invisible to the audience but equally important. Your body is sending continuous signals to your own nervous system, regulating your hormonal chemistry, calibrating your stress response, determining how available your prefrontal cortex is for the complex real-time processing that hypnotic speaking requires. The speaker who stands with collapsed posture and tight, restricted gestures is not just communicating nervousness to the audience. They are actively generating more nervousness in themselves, in real time, through the biochemical consequences of that posture. The speaker who stands with an open, expansive, grounded physical presence is not just projecting confidence. They are manufacturing it, chemically, moment by moment, through the simple act of how they have chosen to arrange their body in space. Let's start at the ground and work upward, because the foundation of physical presence begins exactly where you make contact with the floor. The feet, how a speaker stands, the weight distribution, the relationship between the feet, the quality of rootedness or restlessness in the lower body, communicates more about their relationship with the room than almost any other single physical variable. The most common error that nervous speakers make is what movement coaches call floating, a state where the speaker's weight is never fully committed to any position, where they are perpetually mid-shift, perpetually transitioning between postures without ever arriving in one. The floating speaker rocks subtly from foot to foot, drifts in small, aimless circles, sways without rhythm or intention. This movement is a direct, visible translation of an unquiet mind, a nervous system that cannot settle, a speaker who is not quite present in their own body. The audience reads as exactly what it is, a person who is not fully here. The antidote is deliberate groundedness, the physical practice of feeling the floor under your feet before you begin to speak, distributing your weight evenly between both feet, and making a conscious choice to be still until you decide to move with intention. Stillness is not rigidity. It is authority. The person who can stand completely still in front of an audience, not frozen, not tense, but genuinely at rest, communicates at an entirely primal level that they have no need to flee, that this is their territory, that they belong here more completely than anyone else in the room. Now let's talk about movement, because stillness without movement becomes statue, and a statue, however impressive, does not hold a room for 45 minutes. The principle that governs movement for a hypnotic speaker is one that takes approximately 10 seconds to state and years to fully embody. Every movement should mean something, and nothing should move without a reason. This is the difference between a speaker who paces, who moves because their nervous energy has to go somewhere, and a speaker who travels deliberately through the physical space of the stage as an expressive act. When you move toward the audience during a moment of intimacy or vulnerability, you are making a spatial statement. I am coming closer to you. I am reducing the distance between us. This is a moment where the wall comes down. When you move away from the audience during a moment of challenge or provocation, when you have just said something they need to sit with, when you have asked a question that deserves to land in silence before you speak again, you are creating space for the idea to exist independently of you. When you move to one side of the stage, you are physically turning a page, telling the audience's spatial processing system that a transition is happening. When you plant both feet and stand absolutely still at the moment of your most important statement, you are using the contrast of that stillness against all preceding movement as a spotlight, directing the entire room's attention to precisely this word, precisely this moment, precisely this idea that must not be missed. The hands are where most speakers live in constant low-grade anxiety, and the hands are where the audience's eyes go when the speaker is not saying something interesting enough to hold their gaze. There are 3 states that hands can be in during a speech, and 2 of them create problems. The first problem state is disappearance. The hands hidden in pockets, clasped behind the back, gripping the sides of the lectern, folded tightly in front of the body. Hidden or constrained hands produce 2 distinct negative effects. For the audience, they create a subliminal sense of unease. Research by behavioral analyst Vanessa Van Edwards shows that the human brain, when it cannot see another person's hands, generate a low-level threat response, an echo of the ancient survival instinct that needed to verify whether a stranger was carrying a weapon. For the speaker, Physically constraining the hands reduces the brain's expressive capacity. There is significant neuroscientific evidence that hand gesture and verbal language are processed in overlapping neural regions, and that restricting gesture actually restricts verbal fluency. Speakers who speak with their hands literally think better and speak more clearly than speakers who keep their hands still. The second problem state is chaotic animation, hands in perpetual, undifferentiated motion, fluttering and chopping and circling in a constant visual noise that the eye eventually learns to filter out, at which point the gestures have lost all communicative value. The effective state, the one that serves both the speaker's neural fluency and the audience's ability to track meaning, is intentional gesture, hands at rest in neutral position when nothing specific needs to be illustrated, and moving with precision in clear shapes at moments when a physical gesture can extend or amplify the meaning of the words. Let us talk specifically about the geometry of gesture, because different gesture shapes carry different meanings that are processed by the audience at a subconscious level with remarkable consistency across cultures. Open palms facing upward carry the weight of offering. They are the gesture of giving, sharing, presenting something for the audience's consideration. They are disarming and collaborative, and they work powerfully in moments we want the audience to feel invited rather than instructed. The palm facing outward, the classic stop gesture, used briefly and at low intensity, communicates emphasis and boundary. This point is firm. This is where I stand. The hands moving apart horizontally at chest height communicate scale and expansion, and they work with almost musical effectiveness when you are describing growth possibility or the scope of a problem or opportunity. Hands moving together and interlacing communicate complexity and connection, the bringing together of multiple elements into a unified whole. The pointing finger, used directly at an audience member, is almost always a mistake in Western contexts. It triggers a primal defensive response, a sense of being singled out in a way that feels like accusation rather than inclusion. If you need to direct attention toward a person or a section of the audience, an open palm turned in their direction achieves the same spatial function without the aggressive connotation. These are not arbitrary etiquette rules. They are the grammar of a physical language that your audience is reading fluently, whether you are writing in it deliberately or not. The face is the most expressive instrument the human body possesses, and it is also the most honest, because the microexpressions that flash across in fractions of a second are largely involuntary. They happen before the conscious mind has time to manage them. Paul Ekman, the psychologist who spent 50 years mapping the universal language of facial expression, identified thousands of distinct muscle configurations and cataloged emotional states that reliably communicate across all human cultures. What this research means for a speaker is both reassuring and demanding. Reassuring, because the face's involuntary expressiveness means that when you are genuinely inside your material, when you actually care about what you're saying, your face will communicate that care with precision and authenticity that no amount of deliberate performance could produce. Demanding, because the face will also reveal with equal involuntary precision when you are not inside your material. The speaker who delivers a passionate argument with a face that shows none of the passion produces a cognitive dissonance in the audience that they may not be able to name, but will feel as something slightly wrong, slightly untrustworthy, slightly off. The alignment of facial expression with verbal content is not a performance skill. It is an authenticity skill. The practice is not to manage your face, but to manage your relationship with your material, to return to it inside yourself before every delivery, so that when you speak it, you are speaking from genuine contact with the experience rather than the memory of the experience. Eye contact is perhaps the most discussed and most misunderstood element of physical presence in public speaking. The standard advice is to make eye contact with various parts of the room, to avoid staring at one person or one section, to not look at your notes too much. All of this is technically correct and entirely misses the point. What the research on eye contact actually shows is that the quality of the gaze matters infinitely more than its distribution. A speaker who sweeps the room with rapid, surface-level eye contact, touching each section briefly like a lighthouse beam passing over rocks, is technically making eye contact with everyone and connecting with no one. The audience reads this sweep as exactly what it is, a performance of connection rather than connection itself. The eye contact that creates genuine rapport is settled eye contact, the kind where you actually land on one person actually see them, actually think the thought you are expressing to that specific human being, and hold that connection for 3 to 5 seconds it takes to complete a full sentence. Then you move. Then you land somewhere else, with the same quality of genuine arrival. This is the difference between addressing an audience and talking to people who happen to be sitting together. The first is a broadcast. The second is a conversation at scale. And in a conversation at scale, the person you are currently looking at feels, briefly but powerfully, that they're the only one in the room. And every other person who is watching you look at that person feels a version of the same thing. Because eye contact is socially contagious, and being near genuine connection is almost as powerful as receiving it directly. There is a physical technique used by the world's most commanding speakers that almost nobody names explicitly, even though its effects are immediately visible to anyone who watches great speeches closely. It is called owning the space before you speak, the practice of establishing a physical relationship with the room, the stage, the air itself, in the moments before the first word is uttered. We touched on this briefly in Chapter 1 when we discussed the 7-second first impression, but it deserves fuller treatment here, because it is a physical practice with specific components that can be trained. The hypnotic speaker. In the 10 to 15 seconds between arriving at the front of the room and beginning to speak, does several things simultaneously. They find their physical center. They feel the floor. They feel their breath. They allow their shoulders to drop and their chest to open. They expand their awareness outward, taking the whole room with a wide, receptive gaze rather than a narrow, focused one. What athletes call soft focus, which produces a physical openness that the audience reads as confidence and calm. They make one genuine, settled moment of eye contact with someone in the room. Not a scan, not a performance, but a real human acknowledgement. I see you. I am here. We are about to do something together. And then they breathe, not a visible, dramatic breath, but a real one, a diaphragmatic breath that lowers the center of gravity of the entire physical system and signals to every muscle in the body that it is safe to be still. This sequence takes between 8 and 15 seconds. To a nervous speaker, it feels like an eternity. To the audience, it feels like the beginning of something worth watching. The relationship between the speaker's body and the audience's body is not a one-way street. And understanding this reciprocity is one of the most powerful tools available to anyone who wants to genuinely move a room. Because the mirror neuron system, the network of neurons that fires both when we perform an action and when we watch someone else perform that action, means that an audience is physically, neurologically performing a version of whatever the speaker's body is doing. When a speaker stands with an open chest and expansive gestures, the mirror neurons in the audience's brains are running a simulation of that openness and expansion. When a speaker slows down and breathes from the diaphragm, a measurable portion of the audience begins to unconsciously synchronize their breathing to match. When a speaker smiles genuinely, not performatively, the Duchenne smile that reaches the eyes and crinkles their corners, the smile that cannot be fully fake without feeling false even to the person producing it, the audience's mirror neurons generate the neurochemical precursors of their own smiles, an emotional state that accompanies smiling begins to be induced in the room without anyone having been told to feel good. This is a physical mechanism of what people describe when they say a speaker lit up the room. They were not speaking metaphorically. The speaker's physical and emotional state was literally transferred through the medium of mirror neurons into the bodies and nervous systems of the people watching. Your body is not the container of your performance. Your body is a performance, and it is broadcasting on frequencies that the audience receives whether you intend it or not. Let us end this chapter with something that the most hypnotic speakers in history have understood, sometimes consciously and sometimes in their bones, about the relationship between physical vulnerability and physical authority. Because these two things, which seem like opposites, are actually the same force expressed in different registers. Physical vulnerability in a speaker, an open chest rather than a closed one, a slight forward lean rather than a rigid backward one, a face that allows what is felt to show rather than managing all expression into professional neutrality, communicates to the audience's nervous system that this person has no need to defend themselves, and a person with no need to defend themselves is, paradoxically, experienced as more powerful, more trustworthy, and more worth following than a person whose entire physical presentation is a fortress of authority. The speaker who stands behind their credentials like behind a shield, who uses volume and certainty and professional rigidity to communicate that they cannot be questioned. That speaker produces compliance at best, but never genuine connection, and never the kind of transformation that hypnotic speaking at its highest level can produce. The speaker who stands in the open, physically, emotionally, intellectually open to the room, who is willing to be seen thinking, seen feeling, seen in the uncertainty that precedes the insight. That speaker does something to a room that all the polish and authority and technical excellence in the world cannot replicate. They make the audience feel safe enough to open in return. And an audience that is opened, that has lowered its defenses, activated its imagination, and made itself genuinely available to be moved, is not just a better audience. It is, for the duration of the time you have together, something closer to a single living thing, breathing in rhythm, leaning in the same direction, waiting for what comes next with a hunger that is itself a kind of gift. That is the room every hypnotic speaker is building, from the moment they walk to the front of it to the moment they say their last word. And the building material, from first to last, is the honest, open, deliberate, alive instrument of a human body. Chapter 7. The Integrated Speaker. Who you become when you master this art. There's a moment that every speaker who has done this work long enough eventually experiences, and it is unlike anything that can be fully described in advance. It happens somewhere in the middle of a talk, not at the beginning, when the adrenaline is still doing its useful work, and not at the end, when the finish line is in sight. It happens in the middle, when you've been speaking long enough that the prepared and the spontaneous have blurred into something that feels like neither. You're saying words you may have said before, but they are arriving in your mouth as if for the first time. You're looking at people you have never met, and you feel, with a certainty that has no rational explanation, that you know something about what they need. The room has stopped being a collection of individuals and has become a single atmosphere, a climate, and you are both inside it and creating it simultaneously. The way a musician is both inside the music and making it at the same time. Time does not exactly slow down, but it changes texture. You are completely present, not performing presence, but actually here in this room with these people in this unrepeatable moment. And the experience is so fundamentally different from ordinary speaking that it almost deserves a different name. This is what integration feels like. This is what becomes available to you when all the elements we have explored in this book stop being techniques you are applying and become a single, unified way of being in front of other human beings. 6 chapters ago, we began with the neuroscience of attention. The discovery that an audience is not a passive receptacle for your ideas, but a collection of living nervous systems running their own programs, governed by the ancient brain's hunger for prediction, novelty, and meaning. We learned that genuine engagement is not something you perform for an audience, but something you create with them, through the precise management of open loops, through the neurological mechanism of story that transforms information into lived experience, through the mirror neuron system that makes your emotional state literally contagious across a room full of strangers. We learned that the brain is a change detection system, that it rewards surprise and is numbed by predictability, and that the most powerful opening move a speaker can make is not to establish authority, but to establish humanity, to create in the first 60 seconds a moment of recognition so genuine that the audience's threat detection system switches off and the channel between you opens. All of this was a foundation. Everything else was built on top of it. In chapter 2, we went inside the engine of story, and we found there's something that should have changed forever how you think about the word presentation. A presentation, in the way most people understand and deliver it, is a transfer of information. A story is a transfer of experience. The difference between these two things is not stylistic. It is neurological, emotional, and ultimately the difference between a talk that is tolerated and a talk that is transformative. We learn the three-room structure, the crucible story, the sensory anchor, the false resolution, and the deep principle beneath all of them. That people do not believe ideas are given. They believe ideas they arrive at. Your story is never really about you. At its best, your story is a mirror, so specifically detailed that it is unmistakably yours, and so universally true that everyone in the room sees themselves reflected in it. The speaker who has learned to tell their own story with this quality of precision and openness has, in a very real sense, become a gift to every room they enter, because the gift they're offering is not expertise or information or even inspiration. It is a rarer, more essential gift of recognition, of being seen, of hearing someone say, out loud, in front of everyone, the thing you thought only you had ever felt. The voice chapter 3, was really a chapter about conviction, dressed in the language of technique. Because the truth about all the vocal tools we explored, pause, pace, pitch, volume, rhythm, resonance, the downward inflection of certainty, the diaphragmatic breath of readiness, is that they are at their most powerful not when they are applied as techniques, but when they emerge from a speaker who is genuinely inside their material. The pause that stops a room is a pause of someone who has just said something they actually believe and is willing to trust the silence to carry the weight of it. The voice that drops to near whisper and makes a room lean and is not doing so because the speaker rehearsed that moment. It is doing so because the speaker has reached the heart of something and the body knows it, and the voice follows the body into the territory of genuine feeling. The techniques are scaffolding. They help you build the structure while the interior is still under construction. But the goal, always the goal, is to reach a place where the scaffolding comes down because the building can stand on its own. When a speaker reaches that place with their voice, it becomes one of the most beautiful things a human being can produce. The sound of a person telling the truth in public, without apology, without performance, without the thin membrane of professional distance between what they feel and what they say. Chapter 4 gave us a hidden architecture of language, the precise, learnable structures through which a speaker can bypass the critical mind and speak directly to the imaginative, feeling, believing part of a listener's consciousness. The presupposition, the double bind, pacing and leading, the artfully vague statement, the power of metaphor as a cognitive filing system, the neurological compulsion of the open question, the simple extraordinary power of the word, because these tools, taken together, form a kind of second language, a layer of meaning that runs beneath the surface of your words and does its work in the listener's mind before the conscious mind is finished evaluating the sentence. Learning this language does not make you manipulative. It makes you articulate at a level that most communication never reaches. There's a profound ethical responsibility that comes with this knowledge, and it is worth naming clearly here at the end. The tools of hypnotic language are not more or less ethical than any other form of influence. What determines their ethical quality is the intention behind them. A speaker who uses these patterns to move people toward their own greater understanding, their own fuller lives, their own deeper connection to what matters. That speaker is doing something genuinely generous with a powerful gift. A speaker who uses them to move people away from their own best interests toward fear or division or false belief. That speaker is doing something that these tools will eventually resist, because the deepest hypnotic language patterns work most powerfully in service of truth. Deception has a structural fragility that authenticity does not, and audiences, even when they cannot name what is false, feel it. In Chapter 5, we learn to read the room, to treat a live audience not as a static backdrop to our performance, but as a dynamic, communicating organism that is giving us information every second we are in front of it. The signals of engagement and disengagement, the social contagion of attention states, the biology of the midpoint dip, the pattern interrupt, the reignition moment, the question as a continuous threading device, the ethics and mechanics of humor as a nervous system reset. All of these gave us a vocabulary for the real-time intelligence that separates the extraordinary speaker from the very good one. The most important thing Chapter 5 was really saying, underneath all the specific tools, is this: the audience is not your audience. They are your partner. Every great talk is not a monologue delivered in the direction of passive receivers. It is a dialogue in which one voice is speaking aloud and many voices are responding in the language of bodies, faces, energy, and collective attention. And the speaker who is listening to all of those responding voices with as much care as they bring to their own prepared words is the speaker who will always find their way to what that specific room, on that specific day, with those specific human beings, actually needed. Chapter 6 brought us the body, the instrument that was broadcasting your message before you open your mouth, and will be broadcasting it after your last word lands. We learned that the body does not just express your internal state, but creates it. That posture and gesture and movement and eye contact and breath are not the packaging of your communication, but its very substance, running on a channel that operates below the threshold of words and reaches parts of the listener's nervous system that language alone can never access. We learned that the mirror neuron system makes your physical and emotional state literally contagious. That an audience does not just see your presence, they feel it in their own bodies, in the involuntary harmonizing of their breathing and their posture and their neurochemistry to yours. We learned that physical vulnerability and physical authority are not opposites but the same force. That the speaker who stands open, who allows themselves to be seen, who does not hide behind the fortress of credential and professional distance, is experienced as more powerful, not less, because they have done the more difficult and more human thing of showing up without armor in front of people they don't know and saying, "Here is what I believe. Here is what I have lived. Here is what I think it means, and I trust you enough to say it out loud." Now, let's talk about what happens when all 6 of these dimensions are working together. When the neuroscience of attention, the architecture of story, the instrument of voice, the precision of language, the intelligence of live reading, and the presence of the body are not separate skills being consciously deployed, but a single integrated capacity expressing itself through you. Because this is where the conversation about technique must eventually give way to a conversation about something larger, and that something is identity. The deepest transformation that hypnotic speaking produces is not in the audience, it is in the speaker. Every time you stand up and tell the truth in public, every time you resist the temptation to perform and choose instead to simply be present with other human beings around something that genuinely matters to you, you become incrementally but irreversibly a different person, a more courageous person, a more articulate person, a person more capable of genuine connection, more comfortable with vulnerability, more trusting of their own experience as a source of wisdom worth sharing. The speaking does not just express who you are, it shapes who you become. And the person who has done this work over time, who has stood in enough rooms, told enough stories, made enough real contact with enough different kinds of human beings, that person carries something into every interaction they have, on stage or off, that other people feel immediately and instinctively, even when they cannot name it. What they feel is someone who is not afraid to be fully present. Someone who has learned, through practice and failure, and the occasional extraordinary success, to trust the moment they are in and the people they are with. Someone who has discovered that genuine communication, the kind that actually changes something in a room, the kind that is remembered years later, the kind that occasionally produces that thick electric silence we described in the very first paragraphs of this book, is not a performance skill. It is a human skill. It is at its core the skill of love, broadly defined. The capacity to see another person clearly, to want genuinely good things for them, and to offer them, without reservation, the most honest and alive version of yourself you can produce. There is a story, and of course there is a story, because there is always a story about the night before Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. He was reportedly seen pacing the hallways of a private house in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, alone in the dark at 3 a.m. The aide who spotted him, assumed the president was working on the speech, revising it, perfecting the language. But Lincoln, when asked, said he was not working on the words. He was thinking about the people, about the families who had buried their sons in the ground of that field, about the young men on both sides of the war who were still alive that night and might not be alive by Christmas, about what it would mean 50 years from now for someone to read what he was about to say in a few hours in a cold field at the dedication of a cemetery. Lincoln was not preparing a speech that night. He was preparing himself to be in genuine relationship with the weight of the moment he was about to inhabit. And when he stood up the next day and delivered 272 words that took less than 3 minutes to say and have lasted 150 years, what the audience heard was not a performance. They heard a man who had stayed up all night, making himself equal to the weight of what needed to be said. The Gettysburg Address is not remembered because Lincoln was a skilled rhetorician, though he was. It is remembered because every word of it was written in genuine contact with the human reality it was trying to honor. That is hypnotic speaking at its highest register. That is what is possible when the techniques become the servant of something true. You do not need to be Abraham Lincoln. You do not need a field full of graves and a nation in crisis to find the material for that quality of speaking. The material is already inside your own life, in the losses you have survived, in the things they taught you, in the failures that rearrange your understanding of what matters, in the moments when you saw something clearly that most people around you are still missing, in the small, ordinary experiences that open when you looked at them closely enough, into something universal and recognizable and worth saying out loud. Every person who has lived a life with any degree of attention has, inside them, the raw material for talks that can move a room. The techniques in this book are not substitutes for that material. They are the tools that allow you to excavate it, shape it, and deliver it in a form that reaches another human being intact, that crosses the space between your experience and their experience without losing what is essential and alive in it along the way. So here's what you do now. You begin, not when your material is perfect, not when you have rehearsed enough times to feel safe, not when the room is the right size and the audience is the right kind and the stakes are low enough that failure feels survivable. You begin now, with whatever room is available to you, with whatever audience will have you, with the best and most honest version of the ideas and stories and insights you currently possess. You will be imperfect. You will say a sentence and feel it land wrong and not quite know why. You will tell a story that moved you in private and find that it falls flat in the room, and you will stand in that flatness and learn something from it that no book could have taught you. You will also occasionally, more occasionally than you expect at first, and more often as you do this work, experience the other thing, the silence that electric and thick and alive, the face in the crowd that changes, almost imperceptibly, as something shifts inside the person wearing it, the person who comes to you afterward and says quietly that something you said was a thing they have been waiting to hear. These moments will not make you arrogant. If you are paying attention to what they actually are, what they actually are is not evidence of your skill. They are evidence of what becomes possible between human beings when one of them is willing to stand up, tell the truth, and trust the room with the full weight of their honest and specific and irreplaceable experience of being alive. That is the art. That is the practice. That is, at the end of everything this book has tried to say, what hypnotic public speaking really is. Not the art of controlling a room, but the art of setting one free. A final note. Every technique in this book is a doorway. The doorways matter. They are real. They are precise. They work, but they are not the destination. The destination is a version of yourself that walks into any room, with any audience on any topic, and is genuinely, unhurriedly, undefendedly there, present with the people in front of you, honest about the knowledge inside you, and alive to the extraordinary, improbable, unrepeatable thing that happens when a human being stands up and tells the truth in a room full of other human beings who have gathered in the middle of their one complicated life to listen. Go be that person. The room is waiting.